The morning mist clung to the glass roof of Paddington Station like memories of old battles. Queen Camilla stood at the entrance to Platform 1, watching early commuters hurry past with their takeaway coffees and newspapers. Most didn't notice her small security detail or the subtle preparations happening around them. She preferred it that way. "Your Majesty, the advance team reports everything is ready for the ceremony," whispered her private secretary, Sarah Chen, approaching with a clipboard clutched against her navy blue coat. Camilla nodded but didn't move from her position. She was studying the faces of ordinary people starting their ordinary Tuesday. A young mother struggled with a pushchair while balancing a toddler on her hip. An elderly man in a worn coat checked his pocket watch repeatedly. Two teenagers shared earphones, bobbing their heads to music only they could hear. "These are the people we remember the fallen for," she said quietly. "Not for grand ceremonies or political speeches, but for moments like this, for the right to catch a morning train without fear." Sarah had worked for the Queen for 3 years, but she still felt moved when Her Majesty spoke like this. The media often portrayed Queen Camilla as formal and distant, but Sarah knew better. She had seen the Queen cry reading letters from military families. She had watched her spend hours personally responding to veterans who wrote to the palace. The station's usual morning chaos swirled around them. Announcements echoed from the speakers about delayed trains and platform changes. A group of schoolchildren in matching uniforms chattered excitedly about their field trip to the Natural History Museum. Their teacher tried to keep them in line while juggling permission slips and water bottles. "Ma'am, perhaps we should move to the prepared area," Sarah suggested gently. "The first veterans will arrive within the hour." Queen Camilla turned from watching the children. "Tell me about them again, the veterans coming today." Sarah consulted her notes. "We have representatives from World War II, Korea, the Falklands, Northern Ireland, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The youngest is Jamie Morrison, 24, who lost his leg to an IED in Helmand Province. The oldest is Arthur Pemberton, 98, who served on D-Day." "Arthur Pemberton," the Queen repeated. "He was at Sword Beach, wasn't he?" "Yes, ma'am, Royal Engineers. He helped clear mines for the advance inland." The Queen's expression softened. "I want to spend proper time with each of them, not just the official handshake and move on, real time." This was why Sarah admired working for her. Other royals might focus on the photo opportunities and media coverage. Queen Camilla always focused on the people. A commotion near the main entrance caught their attention. A small crowd had gathered around a man in a wheelchair wearing a bright red poppy on his jacket. Even from a distance, they could see he was upset about something. "That's Jamie Morrison," Sarah said, recognizing him from the briefing photos. "Should I send security over?" "No," Queen Camilla said firmly. "I'll go myself." Before Sarah could object, the Queen was walking briskly toward the crowd. Her security details scrambled to keep up while trying to look casual. As they got closer, they could hear what was happening. "I told you, mate, I have clearance to be here," Jamie was saying to a station security guard. "I'm supposed to meet the Queen for the Armistice ceremony." The security guard, a young man who clearly felt out of his depth, shook his head. "I don't have anything on my list about a ceremony, and I can't just let anyone claim they're meeting royalty." Several commuters had stopped to watch. Some were filming with their phones. Jamie's face was red with frustration and embarrassment. "Is there a problem here?" Queen Camilla's voice cut through the tension like a warm knife through butter. The crowd turned, and a collective intake of breath swept through them. Even people who claimed not to care about the royal family recognized her immediately. "Your Majesty," the security guard stammered, suddenly understanding his mistake. "I'm so sorry, I didn't realize." "Of course you didn't," the Queen said kindly. "You were just doing your job." She turned to Jamie with a genuine smile. "Mr. Morrison, I presume, I'm Camilla. Thank you so much for coming today." Jamie's anger melted away instantly. "Your Majesty, they said, I mean. They said you were causing trouble." She glanced around at the dispersing crowd with a slight smile. "Good. That tells me you're a soldier who doesn't back down when he knows he's right." The crowd began applauding spontaneously. Someone shouted, "God save the Queen," and others picked up the chant. Queen Camilla acknowledged them with a gracious wave but kept her attention on Jamie. "Now then," she said, "would you like to see where we'll be holding our ceremony? I think you'll find it quite moving." As they walked deeper into the station, Jamie beside her wheelchair and the growing entourage trailing behind. Queen Camilla began explaining her vision for the day. Paddington Station has always been a place of journeys, she said. During the war, children evacuated from London passed through here. Soldiers departed for training camps. Families said goodbye, not knowing if they'd see each other again. They paused beside a memorial plaque that most commuters walked past without noticing. It commemorated the great Western Railway workers who died in both world wars. These men kept the trains running while bombs fell on London, the Queen continued. They never fired a shot in anger, but they served their country just as surely as any soldier. Jamie studied the names on the plaque. I never knew about this. Most people don't. That's why ceremonies like today matter, not just to remember the famous battles, but to honor everyone who served. A small girl, perhaps 6 years old, broke away from her mother and approached the Queen with the fearless curiosity of childhood. Are you really the Queen? She asked. Camilla knelt to the child's level, her security detail tensing but not interfering. I am. What's your name? Sophie, are you here because someone died? The directness of children never ceased to amaze adults. Queen Camilla considered her answer carefully. I'm here because a long time ago, some very brave people fought to keep you safe, she said. Today we remember them and say thank you. Like superheroes? Exactly like superheroes, but real ones. Sophie's mother finally caught up, mortified that her daughter had interrupted the Queen. I'm so sorry, Your Majesty. Sophie, come away this instant. It's perfectly fine, Queen Camilla assured her, standing gracefully. Children should ask questions, that's how they learn. As Sophie and her mother disappeared into the crowd, Jamie shook his head in amazement. The papers never show you like this. The papers show what sells newspapers, the Queen replied pragmatically. But this is why I wanted today's ceremony here, in a working station with real people, rather than in some sterile government building. They continued walking toward Platform 8, where the main ceremony would take place. The platform had been decorated subtly with wreaths and British flags, but not so much that it stopped being a working railway platform. Tell me about Afghanistan, Queen Camilla said to Jamie as they walked. Not the official version, the real version. Jamie was quiet for a moment. It was complicated. We went there to help people, but it was hard to tell if we were actually helping or just making things worse. The Taliban never wore uniforms. Anyone could be an enemy. That must have been terrifying. The worst part wasn't the fighting, Jamie said slowly. It was coming home and trying to explain it to people who wanted simple answers. They wanted to know if we won or lost, if it was worth it, if the Afghans appreciated us being there. And what did you tell them? I told them I did my job. My mates did their jobs. Some of them didn't come home. That's all I know for certain. Queen Camilla stopped walking and turned to face him fully. That's enough. That's everything. More veterans were arriving now. Arthur Pemberton moved slowly but steadily, refusing his grandson's offer of a wheelchair. His medals clinked softly with each step. Behind him came Margaret Hayes, who had served as a nurse in Korea, her white hair perfectly styled despite her 87 years. The old ones are tougher than the young ones think, Jamie observed, watching Arthur navigate the platform with determination. And the young ones are tougher than the old ones remember being, Queen Camilla replied. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, but the Queen showed no signs of rushing. She greeted each veteran personally, asking about their service, their families, their lives since the military. Her questions weren't scripted or superficial. She listened to the answers with the kind of attention that made each person feel like the most important individual in the room. Sarah Chen watched from a distance, keeping track of the schedule but knowing better than to interrupt. This was Queen Camilla at her best, connecting with people in a way that seemed effortless but required tremendous emotional energy. A television crew from the BBC had set up near the platform, but the Queen ignored them completely. Today wasn't about coverage or publicity. It was about something more fundamental. Your Majesty, Arthur Pemberton said when his turn came, his voice still strong despite his age. I wanted to thank you for doing this here with regular folk around. Too many of these things happen in fancy buildings where ordinary people feel out of place. This is exactly where it should happen, she replied. This is where real life happens. The platform was filling with more people now. Some were relatives of veterans, others were curious commuters who had realized something special was taking place. A group of railway workers had gathered respectfully at one end, still wearing their high-visibility jackets. "5 minutes until we begin, ma'am," Sarah announced quietly. Queen Camilla nodded, but continued her conversation with a veteran from Northern Ireland, who was explaining how different that conflict had been from conventional warfare. "We were peacekeepers one day, soldiers the next," he was saying. "The politicians called it many things, but to us, it was just trying to stop people from killing each other over things that happened centuries ago." "Did you succeed?" the Queen asked. "Mostly, yes, the peace held, but it cost a lot of good people." The station's normal announcements had been suspended for the ceremony, creating an unusual quiet amid the usual bustle. Commuters moved more slowly, sensing the solemnity of the occasion without fully understanding it. Margaret Hayes approached the Queen with the measured steps of someone accustomed to hospital corridors. "Your Majesty, I wanted you to know that this means everything to those of us who served in forgotten wars." "Korea wasn't forgotten," Queen Camilla said firmly. "It was overlooked, which is different and wrong. The young people today don't know anything about it. They barely know about the Falklands. Then it's our job to teach them, not through lectures but through stories, through days like today." The crowd had grown to several hundred people now, a mix of veterans, families, commuters, and railway staff. The atmosphere was respectful but not somber, exactly what Queen Camilla had hoped for. "Ma'am, we really should begin now," Sarah said with gentle urgency. Queen Camilla took one last look around the platform, at the faces of people who had come to remember, and those who had simply stumbled into remembrance. She saw Arthur Pemberton standing straighter than his age should have allowed, Jamie Morrison's hand resting on his wheelchair with quiet pride, Margaret Hayes dabbing at her eyes while trying not to smudge her makeup. "Yes," she said finally, "it's time to begin." But as she moved toward the small podium that had been set up, she knew that the real ceremony had already started the moment she had chosen to come to Paddington Station instead of Westminster Abbey. It had started when she decided to meet real veterans in a place where real life happened. The 2-minute silence would be observed in a few minutes, but the remembrance had already begun. It lived in Jamie's determination to be here despite bureaucratic obstacles, in Arthur's refusal to let age defeat him, in Margaret's insistence that forgotten wars be remembered. This was what Armistice Day was truly about, Queen Camilla thought as she prepared to speak. Not grand gestures or political statements, but simple human recognition that some people had given everything so that others could catch morning trains, rush to work, take children on school trips, and live ordinary lives in freedom. The platform fell silent as she approached the microphone, but the silence felt full rather than empty, pregnant with memory and meaning, and the presence of those who were no longer there to catch trains or kiss their children goodbye or complain about delayed services. It was, she realized, exactly the right kind of silence for remembering everything that mattered most. The microphone squealed with feedback for just a moment before settling into silence. Queen Camilla didn't flinch at the sound, but several commuters looked up from their phones, suddenly aware that something significant was happening on Platform 8. "We gather today not in a cathedral or palace," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the platform, "but here where ordinary life continues, where people begin journeys, end them, and sometimes change the direction of their lives entirely." A train pulled into Platform 6 with its usual mechanical wheezing and hydraulic sighs. The Queen paused until it settled, understanding that this interruption was part of what made the location perfect. Real life didn't stop for ceremonies, and ceremonies shouldn't pretend otherwise. During the Great War, this station saw thousands of young men depart for training camps they would never return from. In the Second World War, children with cardboard labels around their necks passed through these platforms, evacuated from London to safety in the countryside, leaving behind everything they knew. Margaret Hayes closed her eyes, remembering her own evacuation from Portsmouth in 1941. She had been 7 years old, clutching a doll and a paper bag with sandwiches that had gone stale before she reached her foster family in Wales. Today, we remember all of them. Not just the soldiers who fell in foreign fields, but the families who waited for letters that never came, the workers who kept essential services running under bombardment, the children who grew up too fast in a world at war. Arthur Pemberton shifted his weight from foot to foot, a habit developed during long military inspections. He was thinking about D-Day morning, when his unit had waited on landing craft for hours before hitting Sword Beach. The smell of diesel fuel and vomit, the sound of engines and prayers, young men trying not to show their fear. "Mr. Pemberton," Queen Camilla said, turning toward him, "would you share with us what you remember about that morning in June 1944? The crowd turned to look at the old man, who suddenly found himself the center of attention. He had spoken at school assemblies before, but never with royalty asking the questions. "Well, Your Majesty," he said, his voice surprisingly strong, "the thing people always want to know about D-Day is whether we were scared. Of course we were terrified. Anyone who wasn't scared was either lying or crazy." A few people chuckled softly at his honesty. But fear wasn't the strongest feeling. The strongest feeling was duty, I suppose. We had a job to do. We'd trained for it, we were good at it, and we knew it mattered more than anything we'd ever do in our lives. "What kept you going when you hit the beach?" Arthur was quiet for a moment, looking down at the platform as if he could see sand instead of concrete. "The man next to me," he said finally. "Always the man next to you. You don't fight for king and country in the moment. You fight for the bloke who's depending on you not to let him down." Jamie Morrison nodded from his wheelchair. He understood exactly what Arthur meant. In Afghanistan, political objectives and strategic goals had seemed abstract when bullets were flying. What mattered was the soldier beside you, the one who would carry you to safety if you were hit, the one you would die to protect. "That's something that hasn't changed," Jamie said, speaking without being asked. "Different wars, different enemies, different weapons, but that part stays the same." Queen Camilla smiled at him. "Would you tell us about that?" Jamie hesitated. He had never talked about Afghanistan at a public event, and certainly not with the Queen listening. "In Helmand, we worked with Afghan interpreters who risked their lives to help us. They knew the Taliban would kill them and their families if they were caught. But they did it anyway because they believed in something better for their country." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "One of them, Khalil, saved my life twice. Once by warning us about an IED on a route we were about to take. Another time by talking us through a Taliban checkpoint where we were undercover." "What happened to him?" Jamie's expression darkened. "He applied for asylum in Britain after we pulled out. Last I heard, he was still waiting for an answer, living in hiding with his wife and 2 kids. The platform had grown very quiet. Even the background hum of the station seemed muted. "That's not right," said a voice from the crowd. It was one of the railway workers, a man in his 50s wearing a network rail jacket. "Bloke risks his life for us. We should look after him properly." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. Queen Camilla let the moment develop naturally, understanding that real remembrance included acknowledging current responsibilities, not just past sacrifices. "These are the ongoing costs of service," she said finally. "Not just for those who wear the uniform, but for everyone touched by conflict. We remember the dead, but we also have obligations to the living." Margaret Hayes stepped forward slightly. "Your Majesty, may I say something about the forgotten wars?" "Please do." Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone who had seen more suffering than most people could imagine. "I was in Korea from 1951 to 1953. We called it the Forgotten War even then because all the attention was on rebuilding Europe. But there were British boys dying in frozen trenches, Chinese waves of attackers coming at us in the night, Korean civilians caught in the middle." She paused, composing herself. "I was 22 years old, working in a field hospital near the front lines. We'd get casualties faster than we could treat them. Boys with frostbite so severe we had to amputate fingers and toes. Boys who'd been fighting hand-to-hand with bayonets and entrenching tools." "How did you cope?" Queen Camilla asked gently. "The same way Arthur coped on D-Day. The same way Jamie coped in Afghanistan. You focus on the person next to you. The wounded soldier who needs you to stop his bleeding. The doctor who needs you to hold a patient down while he operates without proper anesthesia." Margaret's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "We lost a lot of boys in Korea. Good boys who died for a country most people couldn't find on a map in a war that ended exactly where it started. But they died believing it mattered." Did it matter? The question came from a teenager in the crowd, genuinely curious rather than challenging. Margaret looked at her directly. South Korea is now a democracy with one of the world's strongest economies. North Korea is still a dictatorship where people starve. You tell me if it mattered. The girl nodded, understanding flooding her face. A train was announced for Platform 9, and about 50 people moved through the crowd toward their departure. Queen Camilla watched them go, noting how the ceremony was taking place within the flow of normal life rather than stopping it. "This is what we fought for," said a new voice. Robert Chen, no relation to the Queen's private secretary, was a Falklands veteran who had been quietly listening until now. So people could catch trains and worry about ordinary things instead of whether enemy bombers were coming. Robert had been 19 when he sailed with the task force to the South Atlantic in 1982. He remembered the surreal experience of going to war while the rest of Britain went about its business, largely unaware that young men were fighting and dying 8,000 miles away. "The Falklands was different because it was so far away," he continued. "Most people at home barely noticed we were at war until it was over. We'd be in firefights with Argentine troops while people back here were watching soap operas and complaining about the weather." "Did that bother you?" Queen Camilla asked. "At first, yes. It seemed wrong that life was normal here while we were sleeping in shell holes and eating cold rations. But then I realized that was the point. We were fighting so life could stay normal for everyone else." A middle-aged woman in the crowd raised her hand tentatively. "My brother was on the Sheffield when it was hit. He survived, but he never really talked about it." Robert nodded knowingly. "A lot of us didn't talk about it. What could we say? How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it's like to see your ship burning, to watch friends die, to keep doing your job when you're terrified?" "But maybe that was a mistake," said Jamie from his wheelchair. "Maybe we should have talked more. Maybe people need to understand what war actually costs." "Perhaps," Queen Camilla interjected thoughtfully, "that's part of what today is about. Creating space for those stories to be told and for them to be heard properly." She gestured toward the growing crowd, which now included several families with children, more commuters who had stopped to listen, and a group of schoolchildren whose teacher had decided this was more educational than their planned museum visit. "These young people," she continued, looking toward the schoolchildren, "they'll inherit the world we leave them. They should understand what previous generations sacrificed to give them choices about their future." One of the schoolchildren, a boy of about 12, raised his hand like he was in class. "Yes," the Queen said with a smile. "My grandfather was in Iraq, but he died before I was born. My mum says he was different when he came back." The platform fell silent again. This was the other side of military service that ceremonies often avoided discussing, the invisible wounds that lasted long after the shooting stopped. "What was your grandfather's name?" Queen Camilla asked. "Corporal David Mitchell." "And he served in Iraq?" "Yes, Your Majesty, 2 tours. My mum says he used to wake up screaming from nightmares." Jamie wheeled his chair closer to the boy. "Your grandfather was dealing with what we call PTSD now, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not a sign of weakness. It's what happens when good people see terrible things." "Did you have it too?" Jamie nodded. "I still do sometimes. There are nights when I wake up thinking I'm back in Afghanistan. Loud noises can make me jump, but I get help for it now and it's getting better." The boy's teacher, who had been listening with growing amazement at the conversation happening around her pupils, stepped forward. "I think this is exactly what our children need to hear," she said to Queen Camilla. "Real stories from real people, not just dates and battle names from textbooks." "What school are you from?" the Queen asked. "Paddington Academy. We were actually heading to the Natural History Museum, but this is so much more valuable." Arthur Pemberton chuckled. "When I was your age, we learned about the Great War from men who'd fought in it. They'd come to our school and show us their medals, tell us about life in the trenches." "What did they tell you?" "That war was necessary sometimes, but never good. That the important thing was to remember the cost, so we'd think very carefully before paying it again." Margaret Hayes nodded in agreement. "Every war I lived through was supposed to be the last one. But there's always another crisis, another threat, another reason why young people have to risk their lives for political decisions made by old people." "Does that make you bitter?" asked the boy's teacher. No, Margaret said firmly. It makes me determined that each sacrifice should count for something, that we should learn from each conflict and try to handle the next crisis differently. The BBC camera crew had been filming throughout the conversation, but so discreetly that most people had forgotten they were there. The cameraman was capturing something unprecedented, a real discussion about war and peace, sacrifice and remembrance, with royalty, veterans, and ordinary citizens all participating equally. Queen Camilla checked her watch. They had been talking for nearly an hour, and the formal 2-minute silence was supposed to begin soon. But she was reluctant to interrupt the flow of conversation that had developed. "Your Majesty," Sarah Chen said quietly, "should we proceed with the silence?" Before the Queen could answer, Arthur Pemberton spoke up. "If I may suggest, Your Majesty, perhaps the silence would mean more now that we've talked about what we're remembering." She looked around at the faces surrounding her. Veterans from 5 different conflicts, schoolchildren learning history from primary sources, commuters who had become accidentally involved in remembrance, railway workers representing the home front that kept essential services running. "I think you're absolutely right," she said. As she prepared to call for the silence, Queen Camilla realized that something remarkable had happened. They had created exactly the kind of remembrance she had hoped for, not a formal ritual performed by officials, but a genuine conversation between generations about the cost of freedom and the responsibility that comes with it. The platform had become a classroom, a counseling session, a memorial service, and a community gathering all at once. This was remembrance as it should be, living, breathing, honest, and deeply human. The announcement echoed through Paddington Station with unusual solemnity. "Ladies and gentlemen, in 2 minutes we will observe a period of silence in remembrance of those who gave their lives in service to our country. We ask that you join us in this moment of reflection." Queen Camilla stood quietly as the diverse crowd around Platform 8 began to settle into position. What had started as a small ceremony had grown organically into something much larger and more meaningful. Commuters had put away their phones. Children stood close to their parents. The veterans formed a loose semicircle, but not in any formal military arrangement. "Before we begin our silence," the Queen said, her voice carrying across the platform, "I want to thank everyone who has shared their stories today. This is exactly what remembrance should be, not just reading names from monuments, but understanding the real people behind those names." She paused, looking directly at the group of schoolchildren. "And I want the young people here to understand that this isn't ancient history we're talking about. These conflicts shape the world you live in today. The freedoms you enjoy, the opportunities you have, the choices you can make, all of them were preserved by people who gave up their own choices, their own opportunities, sometimes their own lives." Jamie Morrison adjusted his position in his wheelchair, making sure he could see both the Queen and the veterans around him. The IED that had taken his leg had also left him with chronic pain, but he wouldn't miss this moment. "When the silence begins," Queen Camilla continued, "think about the cost of the ordinary Tuesday morning you're living through. Think about the price that was paid so you could catch a train, go to work, take your children to school, complain about the weather, fall in love, dream about the future." Margaret Hayes dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. In all her years attending remembrance services, she had never heard anyone speak so directly about what they were really remembering. "Think about the young people who never got to grow old, who never got to see how their sacrifice turned out, who died believing that somehow their deaths would make the world safer for the rest of us." A train was approaching Platform 7, but it seemed to slow as it entered the station, as if even the railway system understood the gravity of the moment. Arthur Pemberton stood as straight as his aged spine would allow. He was thinking about Billy Henderson, who had been standing next to him when they hit Sword Beach. Billy had been 19, engaged to a girl named Susan who worked in a munitions factory in Birmingham. Billy had shown everyone her photograph at least a dozen times during the voyage across the channel. Billy had made it exactly 30 yards up the beach before German machine gun fire cut him down. Arthur had crawled back to drag him to safety, but Billy was already gone, still clutching Susan's photograph in his hand. "The silence is not empty," Queen Camilla said. "It's full of all the words they never got to say, all the conversations they never got to have, all the children they never got to meet." The boy who had spoken about his grandfather raised his hand again. "Yes," the Queen said. Should I think about my grandfather during the silence? Think about whatever feels right to you. There's no wrong way to remember someone who served. The station's usual background noise, announcements, footsteps, conversations, the rumble of trains, began to fade as word spread that something significant was happening. Even people on other platforms started to quiet down, sensing the solemnity without fully understanding it. "We will observe 2 minutes of silence," Queen Camilla announced, "beginning now." The silence that fell over Paddington Station was unlike anything most people there had ever experienced. It wasn't the enforced quiet of a library or theater, but something deeper and more profound. It was a silence filled with presence rather than absence. Jamie closed his eyes and found himself back in Helmand Province, not in the terrifying moment when the IED exploded, but in the quiet times between patrols when he and his mates would sit outside their base, sharing stories about home. Danny Phillips talking about his girlfriend's pregnancy. Tommy Wright planning the pub he wanted to buy when he got out of the army. Sarah Kim describing the university course she planned to take. Danny had been killed 2 weeks before the unit was scheduled to rotate home. Tommy had lost both arms to a roadside bomb and was still learning to use prosthetics. Sarah had completed her tour but suffered severe PTSD and couldn't handle university crowds. Margaret Hayes was remembering the Korean winter of 1952, when the field hospital had been overwhelmed with frostbite cases. She had worked 18-hour shifts, trying to save fingers and toes and sometimes whole limbs from the killing cold. The boys would joke to keep their spirits up, calling themselves the Frozen Chosen and making up songs about how much they missed warm beds and hot food. One boy, Peter Cameron from Glasgow, had been so badly frostbitten that they'd had to amputate both feet. He was only 19, the same age as Margaret's brother back home. Peter had cried not from pain, but from worry about how he'd support the girl he planned to marry. "I'll never be able to work construction again," he had whispered to Margaret during one of her night rounds. "What kind of husband will I be?" Margaret had held his hand and lied kindly, telling him everything would be fine, that he'd find a way to build a good life. She never found out if her lies became truth. Arthur Pemberton wasn't just remembering D-Day. He was thinking about the entire war, the 6 years that had stolen his youth and shaped everything that came after. The friends who hadn't made it home. The French families who had hidden him when he was separated from his unit during the advance inland. The German prisoners who turned out to be frightened boys, not monsters. He was remembering VE Day in London, when everyone celebrated the end of the war in Europe. He had been on leave, walking through crowds of delirious civilians, but he couldn't join their joy. Too many good men were still buried in foreign soil. The victory felt hollow without them. Robert Chen was thinking about the Falklands, about the strange experience of fighting a war that most people back home barely noticed. He remembered the moment when the Argentine positions on Mount Longdon were finally overrun, the relief of realizing he had survived, immediately followed by guilt that some of his friends hadn't. He was remembering Corporal Jake Morrison, no relation to Jamie, who had been killed by sniper fire during the final advance on Stanley. Jake had been carrying a letter from his mother that he'd planned to answer after the fighting stopped. Robert still had that letter. He'd carried it home, intending to return it to Jake's family, but had never found the courage to face Jake's mother. The schoolchildren stood quietly, trying to understand the weight of the moment. Some were thinking about their grandfathers and great-grandfathers. Others were trying to imagine what it would be like to be their age and suddenly have to fight in a war. The teacher, Mrs. Patricia Williams, was thinking about her own father, who had served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. He had never talked about it much, just occasional mentions of road checkpoints and bomb scares, and the constant tension of trying to keep peace between communities that had been enemies for centuries. She was remembering the night he'd come home after a car bomb had killed 4 soldiers at a checkpoint he'd been manning the week before. He'd sat at the kitchen table, still in his uniform, and cried for the first time she'd ever seen. Her mother had sent her to bed, but she'd listened from the stairs as her father talked about how young the dead soldiers had been, how they'd been laughing about a football match just hours before the explosion. The commuters who had been caught up in the ceremony found themselves thinking about things they hadn't considered in years. A businessman remembered his uncle's war stories about rationing and blackouts and the Blitz. A young mother thought about the evacuee children who had passed through this very station, wondering if she could have sent her own children away to safety. Even the railway workers were affected by the silence. They worked in a place where thousands of people passed through every day, but they'd never really thought about the historical weight of the location. Now they were imagining the teenage soldiers who had said goodbye to their families on these platforms, not knowing they'd never return. The silence stretched on, deeper and more meaningful than anyone had expected. It wasn't just 2 minutes of quiet. It was a moment when an entire crowd of strangers found themselves connected by shared recognition of sacrifice and loss. Queen Camilla stood with her eyes closed, thinking not about grand historical moments, but about individual faces. The military families she'd met over the years. The mothers who had lost sons and daughters in Iraq and Afghanistan. The fathers struggling to understand children damaged by combat stress. The wives and husbands learning to love spouses who had returned home fundamentally changed. She was thinking about the responsibility that came with remembrance. It wasn't enough to observe moments of silence and lay wreaths. The living had obligations to the dead, to learn from their sacrifice, to work for peace when possible, to support those still serving and those who had served. As the 2 minutes drew to a close, the silence seemed to deepen rather than lighten. No one wanted to be the first to break it. The moment felt too sacred, too full of meaning, too connected to something larger than any individual present. Finally, the distant sound of Big Ben's 11 o'clock chime drifted across London, reaching Paddington Station and marking the traditional end of the silence. But even then, the crowd was slow to stir. The silence had become something precious that no one wanted to lose. When Queen Camilla finally spoke, her voice was soft but carried clearly across the platform. "Thank you," she said simply. "That was the most meaningful silence I have ever experienced." The crowd began to stir, but slowly, reverently. No one rushed to leave or immediately return to their phones. The moment had changed something in everyone present. Jamie Morrison wiped tears from his eyes, not embarrassed by them. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, he felt that his service had been truly understood by people who hadn't shared the experience. Margaret Hayes reached out and squeezed the hand of the woman standing next to her, a complete stranger who had been crying during the silence. No words were needed. Arthur Pemberton stood for a moment longer, his eyes still closed, finishing a conversation with Billy Henderson that had been interrupted by machine gun fire 79 years earlier. The BBC camera crew had captured something extraordinary, 2 minutes of television that would be completely silent except for the distant sounds of the station. It would be some of the most powerful footage they ever broadcast. But the real power of the moment wasn't in what could be filmed or recorded. It was in the transformation that had taken place in the hearts and minds of everyone present. They had experienced remembrance as it was meant to be, not as a duty or tradition, but as a living connection between past and present, between sacrifice and freedom, between the dead and the living who carried their memory forward. The silence lingered even after it officially ended, like the echo of a bell that continues to resonate long after the last chime. Queen Camilla watched as the crowd around Platform 8 slowly began to move again, but differently than before. People weren't rushing back to their commutes or checking their phones immediately. Something fundamental had shifted. "That was beautiful," said a voice from the crowd. It was the woman who had grabbed Margaret Hayes' hand during the silence, a complete stranger who now felt connected to everyone present. "I've never felt anything like that." Margaret nodded, still holding the woman's hand. "In 50 years of remembrance ceremonies, neither have I." Queen Camilla approached the microphone again, but this time she spoke without formal ceremony, as if addressing friends rather than subjects. "What we've just experienced together shows us something important about remembrance," she said. "It's not meant to be observed from a distance or performed out of duty. It's meant to be lived, felt, and shared." The schoolchildren who had been part of the ceremony were no longer fidgeting or whispering. They stood quietly, still processing what they had witnessed and participated in. "Mrs. Williams," the Queen said, addressing their teacher directly, "I hope you'll encourage your students to talk about what happened here today. Not just the historical facts, but how it felt to be part of remembrance." Mrs. Williams nodded enthusiastically. "This has been more educational than anything we could have learned in a museum. The children have heard real voices, real stories." One of her students, a girl named Emma, raised her hand tentatively. "Yes, Emma," the Queen said, somehow knowing her name though they'd never been introduced. Your Majesty, will you tell our class something about why this matters? Queen Camilla considered the question carefully. She could have given a standard royal response about duty and tradition, but this moment called for something more honest. Emma, imagine if your school was attacked and you had to protect the younger children. Imagine if someone you loved was in danger and you had to choose between your own safety and theirs. That's the choice these men and women made, but on a much larger scale. She gestured toward the veterans still gathered around the platform. They chose to risk everything, their lives, their futures, their dreams, so that you could stand here today as a free person, able to ask questions, to learn, to become whoever you want to become. Emma nodded seriously, understanding more than many adults would have given her credit for. Jamie Morrison wheeled his chair closer to the children. The hardest part isn't being brave for a few minutes during a battle, he said. It's living with what happened afterward, but talking to all of you today, seeing how you listened and asked real questions, that makes everything we went through feel worthwhile. Arthur Pemberton stepped forward, moving slowly but with dignity. When I was your age, children were expected to be seen and not heard. You're lucky to live in a time when your opinions matter, when adults listen to what you have to say. Is that what you were fighting for? Asked another child. So kids could have opinions. Arthur smiled. Among other things, yes. We were fighting for a world where children could grow up free to think their own thoughts, make their own choices, be their own people. Robert Chen joined the conversation. In the Falklands, some of the Argentine soldiers we captured were barely older than you. Teenagers who'd been forced into an army they didn't want to join, fighting for a cause they didn't understand. What happened to them? Emma asked. We treated them well. Fed them, gave them medical care, tried to get them home to their families as quickly as possible. Because the real enemy wasn't those young soldiers. It was the idea that countries should send children to die for political disputes that adults couldn't resolve peacefully. The conversation was interrupted by an announcement that the 11:30 train to Reading was delayed by 15 minutes. Several commuters who had been part of the ceremony sighed in frustration, but their irritation was mixed with something else. A recognition that missing a train was a trivial problem compared to what they'd been hearing about. You know what? Said the businessman who had been thinking about his uncle during the silence. I'm not going to complain about a delayed train today. After hearing these stories, it seems like the least of my problems. His comments sparked murmurs of agreement from other commuters. The ceremony had provided perspective that made everyday annoyances seem insignificant. Queen Camilla noticed this shift and decided to address it directly. One of the gifts of remembrance is perspective, she said to the gathered crowd. When we truly understand what others have sacrificed, our own challenges become more manageable, not less important, but more manageable. Margaret Hayes nodded emphatically. In Korea, we had boys dying from infected wounds because we didn't have enough antibiotics. Now people complain if they have to wait 30 minutes to see a doctor for a cold. Are you saying we shouldn't care about modern problems? Asked a young man who had been listening carefully. Not at all, Margaret replied. I'm saying we should care about them in proportion. We should fight for improvements and solutions, but we should also appreciate how much we already have. Jamie Morrison had been quiet for a few minutes, but now he spoke up with obvious emotion in his voice. The thing that's been hardest for me since coming back from Afghanistan isn't the physical disability. It's watching people argue about things that seem so small compared to what I saw there. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But today, listening to all of you, seeing how you responded to our stories, this gives me hope. It shows me that people can still understand what really matters when they're given the chance. The BBC interviewer, who had been filming discreetly throughout the ceremony, approached Queen Camilla with her cameraman. Your Majesty, this has been quite different from traditional remembrance ceremonies. Was this the response you hoped for? Queen Camilla looked around at the crowd that showed no signs of dispersing, at conversations still continuing in small groups, at children asking veterans questions their parents had never thought to ask. This is exactly what I hoped for, she said. Remembrance shouldn't be a performance for cameras or politicians. It should be a conversation between generations, a bridge between those who served and those who benefited from their service. Do you think this model could be replicated elsewhere? I think people are hungry for authentic connection, the Queen replied. They want real stories, real emotions, real understanding. If we give them opportunities to connect with history on a human level, they respond beautifully. As if to prove her point, Arthur Pemberton was now surrounded by a small group of commuters asking him detailed questions about D-Day. Not the sanitized version from documentaries, but the real experience. The fear, the confusion, the small acts of heroism and humanity that never made it into history books. Were you friends with the other soldiers in your unit? A middle-aged woman was asking. Some of them, Tommy Wright and I, were best mates. We'd grown up 3 streets apart in Manchester but never met until we were assigned to the same squad. What happened to him? Arthur's expression grew sad. Tommy stepped on a mine 2 days after D-Day. He lived but lost both legs, came home angry and bitter, couldn't adjust to civilian life, drank too much, pushed everyone away. Did you stay in touch? I tried, but Tommy didn't want reminders of the war. Can't say I blamed him. The woman nodded thoughtfully. It must have been hard to lose a friend that way. The hardest part wasn't losing him to the mine, Arthur said quietly. It was losing him to the anger afterward. Tommy survived the war but couldn't survive the peace. This kind of honest conversation was happening throughout the crowd. Veterans were sharing stories they'd never told their own families, while civilians were asking questions they'd never known how to ask. Margaret Hayes found herself explaining to the railway workers what it had been like to be a young woman in a war zone. People think of Korea as a forgotten war, but for those of us who were there, it was anything but forgotten. I can still smell the carbolic acid we used to disinfect instruments. I can still hear the helicopters bringing in casualties. Did you ever think about quitting? Asked one of the workers. Every day, but you don't quit when people are depending on you. You find strength you didn't know you had. How did you find it? Margaret considered the question. In the other nurses, mostly, we held each other up. When one of us was breaking down, the others would cover for her until she could pull herself together. Queen Camilla moved through the crowd, listening to these conversations with growing satisfaction. This was exactly what Armistice Day should be, not a single ceremony performed once and forgotten, but an ongoing dialogue between past and present. She paused beside Robert Chen, who was talking to the businessman about the psychological challenges of returning from war. The hardest part was pretending to be normal, Robert was saying. Everyone wanted to welcome you home as a hero, but you felt like a fraud because you'd just been doing your job. But surely you felt proud of your service, the businessman asked. Robert shrugged. Pride came later, much later. At first, there was just relief to be alive, guilt about the friends who weren't, and confusion about how to fit back into a world that had kept going without you. These conversations could have continued for hours, but Queen Camilla was aware that the ceremony needed to come to a natural conclusion. People had trains to catch, jobs to get to, lives to resume. But she also sensed that no one wanted the connection to end. Something special had been created here, and letting it simply dissolve felt wrong. Before we finish today, she announced to the gathered crowd, I want to make sure the stories we've heard continue to be told. Mrs. Williams, would your school be interested in hosting some of these veterans for a proper presentation? Mrs. Williams' eyes lit up. The children would love that, and frankly, so would the other teachers. Mr. Morrison, Mr. Pemberton, Ms. Hayes, Mr. Chen, would you be willing to visit schools, speak to young people about your experiences? All 4 veterans nodded enthusiastically. Then we'll make that happen, the Queen said firmly. Because this conversation shouldn't end here today. It should continue in classrooms, in families, in communities across the country. She looked around at the crowd one more time, memorizing faces and moments. This is what remembrance looks like when it's done right, she said. Not as a duty or obligation, but as a privilege and an opportunity. Thank you all for showing me what's possible when we remember together. The crowd began to applaud, but it wasn't the formal applause of a royal ceremony. It was the warm, sustained applause of people who had shared something meaningful and didn't want to let it go. As the applause faded, Queen Camilla realized that the most important part of the day was just beginning. The formal ceremony was ending, but the real work of remembrance, the personal connections, the ongoing conversations, the changed perspectives, was starting. Your Majesty, Sarah Chen said quietly, approaching with her clipboard, the car is waiting whenever you're ready. But Queen Camilla wasn't ready to leave. She was watching Arthur Pemberton exchange phone numbers with the businessman who had asked about his uncle. She was observing Margaret Hayes showing the schoolchildren a photograph of her nursing unit in Korea. She was seeing Jamie Morrison deep in conversation with Robert Chen about Veterans Support Services. "Give me a few more minutes," she told Sarah. "This is too important to rush." Emma, the schoolgirl who had asked the earlier question, approached the Queen with a piece of paper in her hand. "Your Majesty, I wrote something during the silence. Could I read it to you?" "Of course." Emma unfolded the paper and began to read in a clear, young voice. "Today I learned that heroes aren't just in movies. They're real people who made hard choices so I could have easy ones. They gave up their dreams so I could have mine. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of all the words they never got to say and all the thanks we never got to give them." Queen Camilla felt tears forming in her eyes. "Emma, that's beautiful. Would you mind if I shared that with others?" Emma beamed with pride. "Could you really do that? I think your words capture something important that adults sometimes forget." Mrs. Williams approached with the rest of her class. "Your Majesty, the children have been asking if they could write letters to veterans. Not just the ones here today, but others who might like to know that young people remember their service." "What a wonderful idea," the Queen replied. "We'll arrange for those letters to reach veterans across the country." One of the railway workers, the man who had spoken up earlier about the Afghan interpreter, cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, if I could be bold, what you said about Khalil, the interpreter who's still waiting for asylum. Is there anything ordinary people like us can do about that?" Queen Camilla considered her response carefully. She couldn't make specific policy commitments, but she could acknowledge the moral imperative behind the question. "Public awareness matters," she said. "When people understand the reality of what these interpreters risked and sacrificed, it creates pressure for the right decisions to be made." Jamie Morrison nodded firmly. "I'll be writing to my MP about Khalil specifically, and about the general problem of keeping our promises to people who helped us." "I'll write too," said the businessman. "I never thought about it before, but after today, we have responsibilities to these people." Several other voices chimed in with similar commitments. The ceremony had clearly sparked something deeper than momentary emotion. Margaret Hayes was still surrounded by people asking questions about Korea, but she caught Queen Camilla's attention and gestured her over. "Your Majesty, this young man has been asking about his grandfather who served in Korea. I think you should hear his story." The young man, perhaps 30 years old, looked embarrassed by the attention. "It's not that important, Your Majesty." "Please," the Queen said, "today has taught me that every story matters. My grandfather never talked about Korea except to say it was cold and far from home. He died when I was 15, and I never asked him the right questions. After listening today, I realize I lost the chance to really understand what he went through." Margaret Hayes placed a gentle hand on his arm. "What was your grandfather's name and unit?" "Corporal William Evans, Royal Welsh Fusiliers." Margaret's eyes widened. "Billy Evans, big man with red hair and a laugh you could hear across camp." "That sounds like him. Did you know him?" "Know him? He saved my life once. During a mortar attack on our field hospital, he ran through the shelling to carry wounded from the triage tent to the surgical bunker. One of the bravest men I ever met." The young man's eyes filled with tears. He never told anyone about that. "Men like your grandfather didn't talk about their bravery because they didn't think of it as brave. They thought of it as their job." Queen Camilla watched this reunion between past and present with deep satisfaction. This was exactly what she had hoped would happen. Not just formal remembrance, but living connection between those who served and those who inherited the benefits of their service. Arthur Pemberton was now showing his D-Day medals to the children, explaining what each one represented. But he wasn't just reciting military history. He was talking about the human cost behind each ribbon and star. "This one's for being there on D-Day," he said, pointing to a medal with worn silver edges. "But it's not really mine. It belongs to all the boys who didn't make it off the beach, who never got to show their medals to their grandchildren." "Why do you wear it then?" asked one of the children. "Because someone has to remember them. Someone has to carry their story forward." The child nodded seriously. understanding the weight of remembrance in a way that many adults never achieved. Robert Chen was in conversation with several commuters about the Falklands War, helping them understand how a conflict 8,000 miles away had affected young British soldiers and their families. The strangest part was coming home to a country that barely knew there'd been a war, he was explaining. We'd been through this intense experience, lost friends, seen terrible things, and life here had just continued normally. "Did that make you angry?" asked a woman who had been listening intently. "At first, but then I realized that was actually the point. We'd fought so that life could continue normally for everyone else." "How do we thank you properly for that?" Robert considered the question. "Remember us, not just on Armistice Day, but throughout the year. And when politicians talk about sending troops somewhere, remember that every decision affects real people with real families." Queen Camilla moved toward the platform edge, where a train was finally arriving for the reading commuters who had been delayed. Many of them were reluctant to leave, still engaged in conversations sparked by the ceremony. "This is what we should take from today," she called out to those preparing to board. "These conversations shouldn't end here. They should continue in your homes, your workplaces, your communities." As commuters boarded the train, many turned back to wave at the veterans, the children, and the Queen. Some called out thanks. Others simply nodded with new understanding. The businessman who had been talking to Arthur Pemberton was among the last to board. "Mr. Pemberton," he said, "would you consider having lunch with me next week? I'd like to hear more about your experiences, and I think my teenage son should meet you." Arthur smiled. "I'd be honored." As the train pulled away, Queen Camilla realized that the ripple effects of the morning would continue far beyond Paddington Station. Stories would be shared at dinner tables. Children would ask grandparents new questions. People would think differently about military service, about sacrifice, about their own responsibilities as inheritors of freedom. Mrs. Williams gathered her students for departure, but not before each child had shaken hands with the veterans and thanked them personally. Emma, who had written the poem during the silence, hugged Margaret Hayes impulsively. "Thank you for helping me understand," she said. Margaret wiped away a tear. "Thank you for caring enough to listen." The railway workers were returning to their duties, but their conversations continued. They were talking about the historical significance of their workplace, about the millions of people who had passed through Paddington over the decades, about their own role in keeping Britain moving. "Makes you think differently about the job, doesn't it?" said the man who had spoken up about the interpreter. "We're not just moving people from place to place, we're part of something bigger." His colleague nodded. Every train that runs on time is a small victory for ordinary life over chaos and disruption. As the crowd gradually dispersed, the four veterans found themselves standing together with Queen Camilla, sharing a moment of quiet satisfaction. "This is how remembrance should always be," Jamie said. "Real people sharing real stories, making real connections." "It's what those we're remembering would have wanted," Arthur added. "Not fancy ceremonies that ordinary people can't relate to, but honest conversations about what their sacrifice actually means." Margaret Hayes looked around the platform, now returning to its normal flow of commuters and travelers. "The beautiful thing is that this will continue. Those children will remember today for the rest of their lives. They'll tell their own children about meeting us, about understanding what service really means." Robert Chen nodded toward the departing BBC crew. "And people across the country will see that remembrance doesn't have to be distant or formal. It can be immediate and personal." Queen Camilla felt a deep sense of accomplishment, but also of responsibility. Today had shown what was possible when remembrance was done authentically, but it also highlighted how much work remained to be done. "This can't be a one-off event," she said to the veterans. "We need to find ways to make these connections happen regularly, not just on official occasions." "What did you have in mind?" Jamie asked. "School visits, certainly, but also something more systematic. A program that connects veterans with communities, that makes their stories accessible to people who might never think to ask." Sarah Chen, who had been observing the entire morning with growing amazement, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, I could work with the veterans' organizations and education department to develop something like that." "Please do. Today has shown me that people are hungry for authentic understanding." They want to connect with history on a human level, not just read about it in textbooks. As the veterans prepared to leave, each planning to stay in touch with people they'd met, Queen Camilla reflected on what had been accomplished. The morning had started as a traditional remembrance ceremony and evolved into something unprecedented, a genuine dialogue between past and present, between service and civilian life, between sacrifice and freedom. But more than that, it had demonstrated something essential about British society. When given the opportunity to connect with their history authentically, people responded with curiosity, respect, and genuine care. The cynicism that often characterized public discourse disappeared when faced with real stories from real people. As Queen Camilla prepared to leave Paddington Station, she looked back at Platform 8 one more time. Commuters were hurrying to catch trains. Announcements were echoing from the speakers. Normal life was resuming its pace. But something had changed. The platform would never look quite the same to those who had been part of the ceremony. Every time they passed through Paddington, they would remember the stories they'd heard, the veterans they'd met, the silence that had connected them to something larger than themselves. This was the true victory of the day, not a single moment of remembrance, but a permanent shift in understanding. The past was no longer distant history, but living memory. The cost of freedom was no longer abstract, but personal. The responsibility of remembrance was no longer official duty, but individual choice. As her car pulled away from the station, Queen Camilla smiled. Today had proved that remembrance, when done with authenticity and courage, could still unite a nation. Not through grand gestures or political speeches, but through the simple act of listening to each other's stories and recognizing their shared humanity. The armistice had ended one war 99 years ago. Today at Paddington Station, remembrance had begun another kind of peace, between generations, between military and civilian, between past and present. It was the kind of peace that those who fell in foreign fields would have wanted their sacrifice to achieve. In the end, that was the most fitting tribute of all.